You've spent more than 30 years working in places that have brought you face to face with the impact of human trafficking. Your role as a senior US AID public health official focused on education and the prevention of HIV/AIDS in small rural communities. You're obviously a really compassionate person. So, how did it all begin? How were you drawn to this line of work?
Well, actually, it was 35 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, as you indicated. And my job was basically to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Couldn't understand what was going on. This is a very conservative culture. So we went to go and interview the women and the girls that were in the shelters, and we heard pretty much the same story over and over again. It went something like this. Human trafficker, guy around 20 years old, would go to a remote village and flash a bunch of money around. He wanted everyone to think he was rich. He'd then say, I'm looking for a wife. I don't want an urban wife, I want a rural wife. He'd go around, find somebody who he thought was attractive, 12, 13-year-old girl, befriend her, and then go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughters, going to take care of us. In that part of the world, getting married at that age is very common. After that, they actually have a wedding ceremony. The entire community is there. He then goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to the capital of Nepal, Kathmandu, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where the brothels are. Now, this girl's never been more than 20 kilometers away from her village. When she's in India, she thinks she's still in Nepal. He puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw these women and men milling around, women wearing funny clothes. She said, no, 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 don't leave me here. He says, it's okay. I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the 500 US dollars for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold that is associated with the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over to her. He then leaves to go to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day, because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, 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 no. My husband loves me. No, that's what happened. When many of these girls internalize what is about to happen to them, they say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. I'm a good Hindu girl. The madam then brings out the photograph of the wedding and says, is this your mom, your dad, your brother? You hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You simply shame her. So they bring in a number of professional rapists, and over a kind of 2-day period of time, they'll use this girl over and over again until eventually she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on the line. She will be with 20 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years, she gets what's called black eye, where she's so depleted physically and emotionally and spiritually, nobody wants her. So they throw her out onto the street. Many of them languish in India, die there of AIDS. Some of them get back, and those were the girls that I was talking to. So I was hearing this story over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me. We were going from brothel to brothel. I went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy, saw an opportunity, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me, and said, save me, save me. You're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying, wearing a dress 20 sizes too big because she was a child in an adult's world. I turned to the police officer and said, we need to get this girl out of here. He said, we can't do that. What are you talking about? You're a police officer. He says, if we try to leave, we'll both be killed. To make a long story short, we left, we came back, but of course that girl was gone. Now, I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything in my life not to be one. But every once in a while in life, we are tested. That was my big test. I should have found a way of getting that girl out. When I look back, I can think of 100 things I could have done. I could have just grabbed her and run out. I could have kind of stayed there and had the police come from the other police officer getting them, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't. After that, I was feeling so guilty and so ashamed of myself that I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and did what a lot of activists eventually do. Surrendered to the fact that now that I've been exposed to this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 30 years later, here I am talking to you.
So if we fast forward a little bit from there, when you got to the United Nations, you were in the anti-trafficking world, and you said that you noticed a gap in the engagement with the private sector in their anti-trafficking efforts. I think you said it was not because they didn't want to, but because they feared about being named or shamed for approaching a UN official to ask for help. So tell us how that looked. Like, was there what was causing their sense of shame, and how did it manifest in these businesses?
Well, I'll go back a little bit more and provide a little bit more context to make it more clear. So, back around 15 years ago, the statistics related to human trafficking were getting better. At that time, the number of people estimated to be in modern slavery was about 21 million. And so, at the same time, we were getting better statistics that looked at what we, the counter trafficking world, was doing to address this. And the number that included all of the NGOs and the government and United Nations combined in terms of the number of people we were rescuing each year was about 34,000. When you put those two numbers together, it means that the world was only helping 0.2% of the victims. When we at the United Nations came to that conclusion, we were actually quite upset and concerned. We're not having any impact at all. So we went back to the statistics, and out of the statistics, 21 million people in modern slavery, 75% associated with forced labor. But the other statistic was that 60% of that was associated with supply chains, with private sector. So we said to ourselves, well, we have to talk to the private sector. So as a UN official, I decided that I was going to start going to Hong Kong. That's where a lot of the regional offices are and captains of industry and so forth. And so I would fly up, and because I'm a UN official, they would agree to a meeting. And, I would often kind of sit down with them and have a conversation. And what I found over time was kind of a particular pattern that they would listen to what I had to say. Then they would say, okay, well, we understand the business risk, but we're not going to have a conversation with you because you're coming from that naming and shaming world. You can embarrass us. You can create a situation where our reputation can be uh, tainted by this. And so, as a result of multiple visits there, and because of the fact at that time many of these organizations didn't understand what it was modern slavery was, it was recommended that perhaps what they need is an organization to help them to raise awareness. And so a number of banks and manufacturing companies and so forth urged us to set something up. And so I left the United Nations and I set up the Mekong Club in Hong Kong. So the Mekong Club works with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way in order to help businesses like banks, like manufacturers, like the hospitality sector to understand the issue and then to determine the risk factor and the vulnerability that they have. And we do this in a very private, confidential way to allow for banks to be able to address things. So that was one aspect of this. One other thing that I want to mention about this is another thing that often happens. So because I'm a UN official and you prepare for this months in advance and you contact some people and they agree to a meeting, um, and then when I get there, they're like, "Oh my gosh, I forgot about this meeting with that UN guy. Oh, I'm really, really busy today. I don't know why I agreed to this. Okay, have him come in." So I'd come in and I'd sit down, and this was back when Blackberries were in place, and the guy would say, "Well, I'm really busy today," and he's on his Blackberry saying, "I only have 15 minutes of time, and I'm sorry, it's just the way it is this week." So I'd start talking about cases. I'd talk about forced labor cases. I'd talk about fishing cases, sex trafficking, and so forth. And interestingly, after about 15 minutes, the Blackberry's on the table. 15 minutes after that, he's leaning forward, listening to what I had to say. 90 minutes later, we're still talking. But some of these people are at this point saying, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea this was happening. This is terrible. What are we going to do? How do we get involved in this? How do we address this?" Because for whatever reason, they hadn't been exposed to it from the human standpoint. And as a result of listening to the cases and recognizing that, addressing anti-money laundering or corruption or anything related to human traffic, that there was a real impact, an impact related to people being hurt as a result of this. And so as a result of that kind of reaction, some of the people from these banks, in fact, were the ones that helped us to set up the Mekong Club. one of the things that I'll just tell a story because I think it'll reflect this. And so a couple of years ago, I was in the United States and I was attending a conference, the American Banking Association conference. I did a big presentation. And afterwards, this guy comes up to me and says, I want to tell you a story. I said, that as public speaker, that happens. And so um, go ahead, tell me what you want to say. He said, well, I was taking my wife and teenage daughter from one part of the United States to another. And we were driving and we got to the halfway point and we pulled into a motel. And I got my wife and daughter settled. And I was going out for food and I saw this 14-year-old girl being dragged into a room. And, it looked like prostitution. And I have a teenage daughter. And so, I was a little bit concerned about that. And so I went to the manager and I said, I think there's a problem here. He then went back to his room and he's peeking out of the window to see if anything would happen. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, the police come. 15 minutes after that, that person's being taken out in handcuffs. The girl's being taken to an unmarked car, presumably to a shelter. And he said, I wanted to tell you that because I felt so proud of myself. This is a milestone in my life. So I looked at this guy and I said to him, like, what do you do? He says, I'm a banker. And I said, yeah, you're a banking conference. What do you do? He says, I do anti-money laundering, and we look at the, client base, and we try to, identify where there's risk and so forth. We do suspicious transaction reports, et cetera. I asked him, well, do you ever run human trafficking cases? Oh, yeah, we do that. And I said, dude, don't you realize that you've been doing this work all along? You may not see the outcome of what happens when you get that suspicious transaction report. Maybe it's exactly what you saw that day. Doors being kicked down, people being helped, and so forth. You are a hero. Did you not realize that? And so it took him a couple of minutes, and then he had that aha moment. Oh, yeah, what we do means something. It makes sense. It adds value to what it is. We're not only protecting the company, but we're also helping people. Thank you for that insight. So a couple of months later, I'm in Singapore and I'm on stage and I do a big presentation and I tell the audience, 650 people, mostly compliance people, this story. And I said, you guys are all heroes. Do you realize that by helping your company, you're helping the world to be a better place? I must have had about 10 or 12 or 15 people come up afterwards and say, nobody says that to us. But you're right. What we do is heroic. What we do helps people. And I often say that the NGOs work on this issue, but the banks have been doing this for a long time. You have to protect your business. By doing that, you find bad things and you report it and you address those things, and the world's a better place as a result of it. So when I was going to Hong Kong, I was often using that message to say to the private sector, feel good about what you're doing. Your role has an important part of basically ensuring that people don't get victimized. And you may not think it's relevant and important, but it certainly is.
So, Matt, between 2006 and 2012, you were the regional project manager at the United Nations International Project on Human Trafficking. And yet, at the same time, varying levels of AML laws were being enacted before and after that time. They've been in the UK since 1993, Thailand since 1999, Bangladesh since 2002, Australia Tranche 1 since 2006, and Hong Kong since 2012. So, how do you reconcile the fact that governments are seemingly trying to minimize the ability of criminals to use their ill-gotten gains from the likes of human trafficking, and against what you're seeing on the daily?
The interesting thing about like the issue of human trafficking, modern slavery, forced labor, child labor, when it comes to kind of the government's response to this, is that they often feel like the only organizations that are capable of addressing this would be, let's say, the United Nations or the NGOs. And so much of what you see is the government's moving in the direction of operationalizing these particular groups. But in reality, these organizations are never close enough to the action to make any kind of a difference. The United Nations, for example, and I say this with all due respect to the United Nations. In fact, I'll put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the United Nations system, but I spent a lot of time in five-star hotels getting really good food, talking about human trafficking and debating topics and so forth. We were never close enough to the action. The NGOs, they work well on the community level, but when it comes to understanding the businesses where human trafficking could be associated, they don't really have an understanding of that. And so as a result of that, many of them try to kind of sensitize communities to various things, but they don't understand the driving force of migrants and workers wanting to do things, taking risks, and so forth. So when it comes to that, you have a lot of kind of human trafficking, forced labor, modern slavery that takes place. Now, as a result of these businesses doing these things, ill gotten gains happen as a result of this. This is money laundering. This is basically money that is created from illegal type activities. But up until recently, most financial institutions haven't really understood much about this. And so what they know is that human trafficking is out there and it's this nebulous kind of thing that's occurring and so forth, but they haven't had the specificity. So what we're seeing now in the anti-money laundering world is not based on the government saying it, but for more based on the banks and the financial institutions coming to the conclusion that they have to address this, is a desire to develop typologies related to forced labor. So you see typologies related to sex trafficking, modern slavery on fishing boats, manufacturing, agriculture, and so forth. And the idea is to basically take that information and then apply it to identifying red flags and then running that against big data. And so that a typical kind of example of how this could be used in the United States, there was a nail salon chain run by a Vietnamese group, and the chain had hours from 9 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. And so, people assumed that that's when the business hours were taking place. But an accountant found that there was transactions taking place 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, all around $200. When they looked into it, they came to realize that there was a sex trafficking ring being run in that particular business. And so the typology was set up, and the red flag indicators would be a particular type of business, transactions after hours of a certain amount. They then ran that data against, the big data, and they were able to find patterns and so forth. And that's obviously how a lot of anti-money laundering activities take place. But back to the question of the government's kind of oversight related to this, it's very superficial. It's not very specific. It doesn't kind of provide the specificity that's required in order for financial institutions to really understand what the expectation is. And so at present, it's more of kind of a policy paper exercise than something that is a mandate. That, however, is changing because what we're seeing as sustainability and ESG become relevant and important, and as consumers come to accept the fact that financial institutions have to do right by the world and they have to ensure that they are not supporting anything that would be perceived as exploiting of people, then that pressure is translating into financial institutions stepping up and doing more related to addressing anti-money laundering. One other thing that's coming into the equation is the fact that there is human trafficking into scam centers. It started in Southeast Asia, but now it's expanding all over the world. According to the United Nations, there's about 250,000 young, educated Asians that have been trafficked into Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos to work in scam centers. They're generating tremendous amounts of money that then has to be laundered. And so a new area that we're spending a lot more time focusing on related to anti-money laundering is how do those proceeds that are in crypto that get transferred into fiat or other types of currencies, how does that get laundered? And we recently saw, for example, in Singapore, a major case where something like $3 billion was being laundered from these types of sites. So the point I'm making is that for financial institutions to really understand what they need to do, what they need is regular updates, awareness raising on the topic of modern slavery, on the topic of human trafficking. What are the trends? What are the directions that it's going in? What are we seeing in terms of money laundering approaches? And based on that, that will make a difference. And eventually, I think that the legislation within these countries will catch up, but it's still far behind kind of any kind of a mandate that has any kind of a teeth related to this. So it's up to the financial institutions to do it themselves.
With the looming introduction of AML CTF laws to Australian tranche 2 entities, that's real estate, law, and accounting, many people in industry bodies are fighting the need for it. We see this fight and annoyance in established markets in the UK as well. Companies are reducing their spend. We did some research just recently, and they're spending less on compliance. And senior executives, are bemoaning the burden and cost of compliance. So, Matt, based on your first-hand experience with the human impact of money laundering, what would you say? Why is AML so important for these entities, real estate, law, and accounting?
First of all, let me just give a anecdote that describes how legislation is often kind of resisted, and then when it comes into play, the organizations just say, "Okay, well, let's get on with it." So, in the UK, prior to the UK Modern Slavery Act, there was a lot of resistance, and a lot of companies said, "Well, it's expensive. We can't do this. We don't want to do this," and so forth. And then it got over the line, and they're like, "Okay, what do we need to do?" So I think you're going to have the same type of thing here. If they can reduce it or stop it or prevent it from happening, then you put some effort into it. But I think what will eventually happen once all of this is set and the ink is dried and everything else, companies will get on with it. Now, when it comes to kind of money laundering, the expectation has often been that the financial institutions have to do all the work. But money laundering takes place in all different types of sectors. It happens in real estate, it happens in luxury cars, luxury goods, it happens in all kinds of different forms. And as a result of the financial institutions having a limited scope to be able to address things, it has to be expanded to other organizations. So the reason why this legislation is moving forward is because governments recognize that it has to be a cooperative activity with multiple sectors coming together. And I'm not saying to the real estate sector that you have to do this by yourself. It'll be in partnership with the banks and the financial institutions and financial transactions and law enforcement and everything else. They're just basically saying that you guys have to be a part of something because you're already a part of it and you may not even know it. So, understanding anti money laundering as it relates to your specific real estate business and so forth helps you to understand if you see red flags that you want to report. It helps you to understand whether or not, if something doesn't feel right and you feel like it's moving in a particular direction, you know what to do in that particular case. And so I think it's the type of legislation that's been long overdue. I think a lot of organizations, if they understood why they're doing it, because off the backs of people who have been exploited, this money has been generated and then it's going through your system, a lot of people wouldn't like that. They don't like to know that like the deals that they're doing is from money that is generated from bad things basically taking place in the world. So I think it'll be something that will be accepted and it will move forward. And eventually, 3 years from now, we'll be looking back and it'll just be standard part of where we are now with these organizations accepting this as part of their regular responsibility to do due diligence to ensure that their business is positive and doing right by the world.
So, Matt, final question. You're now the CEO at Mekong Club, whose goal is to uncover and stop the business of human slavery. If there was one piece of advice or encouragement you'd give AML compliance officers or MLROs in relation to how they're supporting of the Mekong Club, what would it be?
Well, I had come in contact with a lot of analysts, people who are on a day-to-day basis trolling through the data, looking into indicators, collecting information, writing out the reports, and so forth. And I often have them say to me, "Well, nobody really pays too much attention to our particular division. They don't really give us the resources that they need. We don't get the pat on the back that we feel like we deserve for the hard work we're doing." And usually what I do is I segue into, okay, let me give you some examples. Let me give you an example of a particular case. And so it was a financial institution that was supporting a fishing business. Okay. And so typical scenario in Thailand is that a 15-year-old boy will be told that he's going to go on a fishing boat and he's going to make lots of money and it'll go out for about 3 months and he'll come back and he'll be a hero to his family and so forth. And so before he goes on the boat, doesn't realize he's been trafficked on the boat. Boat goes out, but it stays out for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 14, 15, 16 hours a day, every day. He doesn't, he gets beaten, gets tortured. The only food he'll eat is rice and fish. In order to get him to work, they give strong stimulants. And as a result of that, his body's constantly on these drugs. If he gets sick, he gets ill, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in, he doesn't get anything. And so we tell these types of stories, and then we relate that story to the fact that you're supporting a particular organization that could have association with that type of business. And all of a sudden, the person perks up and says, "Well, yeah, I never really thought of it that way." And so then we go into an analysis. You do these activities, you look at the transactions. Some of the transactions look a little bit fishy. You get trained on what you need to do for things that don't look right and so forth. And you do these suspicious transaction reports. Do you know why you do them? Well, we're supposed to do them because that's what banks do. Well, no, you're doing it because law enforcement will review that and identify what percentage of these things they want to address. So a certain percentage of what you're doing results in law enforcement going deeper into the situation, identifying where these problems exist and fixing them. Did you realize that you're part of the solution? No. Yes, you are. What you're doing helps the bank. It protects the bank, and that's a good thing. But it also helps the world be a better place. So by you doing that, it's heroic. But for you to be able to do this, you need to have good awareness of the issues of human trafficking, how it works, what the typologies are, what the red flags are, and so forth. And so this is why organizations like mine, the Mekong Club, are working with banks, financial institutions, to help them to understand where the vulnerability is. Because I presented in Bangladesh. I was brought in by a particular bank, and I went and I'm in front of bank managers and compliance and so forth. And I started off by saying, I'm going to talk about modern slavery. Somebody raised their hand and said, well, we don't have slavery. We haven't had slavery for years and years. And I said, okay, well, let me define what modern slavery is. When a person is tricked and deceived into a situation where they lose control of their life and they're held in place, that's modern slavery. It's human trafficking, it's forced labor. So we started giving cases, and all of a sudden, people were saying, "Oh yeah, in my bank, somebody came in and they basically were managing 6 or 7 people, and they didn't let those other people talk to us, and so forth." I think there was a problem there, and they went on and on with these different examples. They didn't know about it because they didn't know about it. And once they did, all of a sudden they had that aha moment where they're like, oh, yeah, I see what you mean. We do have this interface with human trafficking and so forth. So the point I'm making is that, as analysts looking at anti-money laundering, which is a big part of the process because money is generated from these activities, but then it has to be laundered. You have, if you're an analyst, a role in helping to address whether or not something bad is happening. And if you do your job and you're able to then, get the authorities to address this, that's heroic. You contributed to helping people. You may not see it, but it's there. And that's an important point that I always try to get across to a lot of people who think that their job is very routine, when in fact it really isn't. It's very necessary and it helps the world be a better place.